Hey, difficult. How are you doing?
Good. How are you?
Good, good. I hope you don't plan to be difficult.
No, no, I'm not difficult. I'll
Oh,
say.
you're good.
Just a couple of questions on just this argument here.
Yeah,
So, if the PSR is false, then we have no empirical knowledge. We do have empirical knowledge, therefore the PSR is not false.
yeah.
I'm actually wondering what the justification is for the first premise,
Sure,
and
yeah.
you would want to specify like what version of the PSR you're talking about. Are you saying that all facts require an explanation, or are you saying that all facts possibly have an explanation
So what I'm
or
saying
probably
is,
have an explanation?
sure. So let me kind of take those in reverse order. The second one was what PSR are you talking about? That is the principle of sufficient reason. And the first one is why I think that premise one of that argument is true. So the PSR that I'm using for this argument is for everything, so every object that exists or event that occurs, there is a sufficient reason for its existence if it's an object, or its occurrence if it's an event. So that's the version of the PSR that I'm using. So why think that if that's false, we have no empirical knowledge? Why think that? Well, if you look at the sun, like the example I used was the sun. So the sun sheds rays, and we call that sunlight. And so when we have sunlight that approaches the Earth, we infer that it's caused by the sun, this big ball of gas burning millions of miles away. So when we say that, if we're going to deny the PSR, then what we're tacitly admitting is some positive probability that the sunlight is occurring for just no reason at all. It's just not. There's just no explanation. It's not explained in terms of the sun that's millions of miles away. It's just here inexplicably. And when we assign probabilities, we want to say, well, it's probably from the sun. Well, in order to say it's probably from the sun, we'd have to say, well, it's probably not inexplicable. But the problem with that is when you assign probabilities, probability judgments are an assessment of the causes present. So the example I used was if I have a 20-sided die, the probability that I can roll five fives in a row is very low because the die, the cause is present, is unlikely to produce that result. But when we talk about things that are without explanation, they're not explained in terms of the causes present, then we're just unable to assign a probability value to it. And so in that case, on our pie graph there, the blue wedge would be undefined. But it's the nature of the case that if the blue wedge is undefined, then the red wedge is also undefined. And so we end
Mm-hmm.
up without a probability either that it's uncaused, inexplicable, or that it's caused by the sun millions of miles away.
Okay, but um, I mean, we could grant that there is probably going to be an inference that could be drawn as to how an agent is going to know that the sun rises in the morning, but how does it how is it entailed by that, by the contingent fact that the sun rises in the morning, or that the sun rises in the morning, excuse me, that contingent fact, it's going to be entailed from that contingent fact alone that the PSR has to be true in order for me to know that the sun rises in the morning. I'm just asking how that's an entailment, because it seems as if one can perfectly give some sort of, explanation for even things like me having some non-inferential justification for why the sun rises in the morning, for example, or at least for my belief in the sun rising, and it being the case that not all facts are being contingently explained as a result, right? So what I'm saying is that it seems consistent with empirical knowledge that I would be non-inferentially justified in believing that the sun rises in the morning, and it still being the case that not all facts require an explanation.
Okay,
Sorry,
so I'm
not all contingent facts requiring an explanation.
yeah, so it certainly seems to me that empirical knowledge is inferential. I'm not sure how else it could be. So you're inferring things about the world from experiences that you have, such as seeing the sunlight. I'm inferring from the sunlight that there's this source of sunlight that's so many miles away or whatever. So I don't know how you could have non-inferential knowledge of the sun without it being inferred from some sort of data. Can you explain how that would work?
Well, sure. So, I mean, I don't want to get too much into like phenomenal conservatism, but basically the idea is that if an agent like has a direct acquaintance with P and they token that belief in P, and the direct acquaintance is going to involve some intellectual seeming, then in virtue of them being directly acquainted with P, they are non inferentially justified in believing in that P. And that seems consistent with some models of knowledge, which include empirics. So you could have empirical knowledge, whilst that empirical knowledge is like non inferentially justified. That's fine. But
Yeah, so
I,
phenomenal conservatism is inferential. And I agree with phenomenal
yeah, there are
conservatism.
non-inferential. Yeah, to be clear, there are non-inferential and inferential aspects to it. That's fine. But
Okay.
go on.
Well, as you've explained it, the reason why, so you haven't experienced the sun. You haven't put your hand on the sun. Okay. I know you haven't. And so what you've done is you've seen sunlight. And so, and that's all that we can do at this point. Maybe sometime in the future we'll be able to visit the sun, but we at least don't have the technology now. And so our knowledge of the existence of the sun is inferential from sunlight that's coming to us. And so I don't know how you would have a direct experience of the sun other than your visual perception of it, which is the visual perception of that sunlight. So I guess I'm confused on how you would have that knowledge non-inferentially. But the phenomenal conservatism says I have the experience of X, and so I'm justified in believing X. But my belief of X is based
Yeah,
on
the
my
same
experience
thing.
of it. If it's the case that my experiences could be occurring with no explanation at all. I mean, in Proust's original argument, he entertained the idea that there was this demon that it was in a sort of a response to this claim that there's some demon on your shoulder that causes you to have all of your experiences. And how do you know that that's not the case? And then Proust took that one step further and said, well, if you deny the PSR, you don't even need the demon. You could just be having these experiences, and those experiences could just be uncaused. And so it seems to me that phenomenal conservatism is inferential. I agree with phenomenal conservatism, which is one of the reasons why I agree with the PSR. And that was the thrust of this argument, to show that our knowledge rests on the PSR, that knocking out the PSR knocks out quite a bit of our knowledge.
Wait, but that's not dealing with what I said earlier, right? Because it's like even if we presume that all empirical knowledge is inferential, it's not going to be entailed from that like any single contingent fact that you know um like exists in the universe or whatever is going to require a necessary fact in order to explain that.
Yeah, so that was not the thrust of this argument. This argument
Wait,
doesn't
but
deal
it
with
is because
that.
you said that. Wait, but it is because you're saying that in order for us to have empirical knowledge, it's entailed by that fact that the PSR has to be true.
Yes, but it doesn't relate to a necessary foundation. So this argument
No, no, no,
about the
no. I didn't say
PSR.
foundation though. I said that all contingent facts require an explanation, and I'm saying that if you take that strong PSR, you're going to arrive at some necessary fact that explains all the contingent facts, right? And so what I'm saying is that it doesn't follow from the fact that if all empirical knowledge is inferential, that the strong PSR has to be entailed from that.
Yeah. So again, so I think we're mixing arguments. I think that's the problem where there's a confusion. So notice that this argument, the one with about the PSR and empirical knowledge, makes no mention of contingency or necessary or anything like that. It's that's a different part of the argument. And so I'm not in this argument about PSR and empirical knowledge making any claims about necessary facts to explain the universe or anything like that. This argument is just saying that the fact that we have empirical knowledge and that we're justified in empirical knowledge, that what undergirds that is the PSR, and so we deny the PSR at our own peril. So that's kind of the point of that argument. But I'll let you have the last word, and then we'll go to the next person in the queue.
But I don't see. So you understand that the argument wants to run as if we don't have empirical knowledge, then the PSR is false. We do have empirical knowledge, right? Therefore, the PSR has to be true, right? I'm just asking you, like, how is it going to be entailed from the fact that, um, there's a contingent fact that the sun rises in the morning, like you gave the example earlier, and it being entailed from that all facts require an explanation, right? Because you understand what I was saying earlier, when I brought about the fact that you're committed to saying that all the sun rising in the morning is a contingent fact, and that contingent fact either has a necessary explanation or a contingent explanation, right? And given what you said earlier about the PSR, it can't be the case that that contingent fact has a contingent explanation for it, right? And so you have to admit that in virtue of that disjunction, it would have to be a necessary explanation for why that contingent fact obtains, right? And what I said earlier was that necessary facts are going to entail other necessary facts. So the PSR that you're committed to here is going to be a strong one, obviously, but it's also going to entail necessitarianism. And so what I want to know from you is that how is it the case that in order for us to have empirical knowledge, necessitarianism has to be true? And then you can invite other people after you answer that question.
Okay. Well, I do think that you kind of gave you kind of worked through the reasoning yourself. As far as why is it that we would be led to the belief that there's a necessary foundation for reality from the PSR, and it's from, or that is to say, why I think that there's a necessary foundation for contingent objects from the PSR. And my claim, I guess, there is that you wouldn't, that I don't take that part of the argument or that part of the presentation to imply a necessary foundation. It's a different part, namely that when you look at the category of contingent objects and you ask, like, why is there members of that category, then you would need a member that's not of that category in order to explain the members of that category. And so that would be, one of the reasons that I gave for affirming that there's a necessary object. And so it wouldn't be from the PSR directly. It would be, again, from other parts of the presentation. Thank you for listening. If you found this helpful, please like and subscribe. Please also look at the show notes in order to find a link to our group so that you can join our next discussion. I look forward to chatting with you.